10:30, they're going to walk from the Legion to the Library Park, starting off about 10:15, and there'll be a service tomorrow with the lunch following after that at the VFW. So if you want to take part in that, you want to be involved in that, tomorrow morning about 10:30 at Library Park. So, okay, so this morning, the sermon, we're going to finish up with Jesus' prayer in John chapter 17. Then we're going to jump into some of the other Gospels this morning. We're going to get into Matthew and John and Luke. But Jesus has just finished up, or he's in this last part of his prayer. Jesus has prayed for himself, which is very rare. He very rarely ever prayed for himself. He prayed for his disciples, and he's prayed for the unity of the future church. And now he'll conclude his prayer before heading into the Garden of Gethsemane. So let's look how he finishes up his prayer here in John chapter 17, verses 24 through 26. Jesus says, "Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because you have loved me before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, even though the world does not know you, I know you, and these know that you have sent me. I made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known, that the love with which you loved me may be in them, and I in them." So this very tender conclusion recaptures the major points of Jesus' prayer. The glory and revelation of God, the love that God had for Jesus, which he passed on to his apostles, and Jesus' return to his Father. So Jesus wraps up his prayer with that before he gets ready to head into the Garden of Gethsemane, which is where we're going to go at now. And we're going to hear Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane. Now this is Jesus' crucible hour. Here he makes his final decision. Will he go to the cross or not? Well, we know what Jesus is going to do. And we also know that Jesus always obeys his Father, but that doesn't make it one bit easier for Jesus to do. Not since the wilderness temptation has Jesus wrestled so strenuously with the evil one. Nor has he been so alone since his wilderness temptation. Yet, as in the wilderness temptation, in his deepest pain, God sent an angel to minister to him, and as in the wilderness, Jesus resolves to carry out his mission. And from here on out, there will be no hesitancy, no more questions, and there will be no turning back for Jesus. So let's look what Matthew 26, verse 30 says. Matthew 26:30 says, "And when he has finished praying, and they sang a hymn, they went out and crossed the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, as usual." And Matthew 36 through 38 says, "Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, James and John, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And he said to them, 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me.'" So the Passover meal concludes with Jesus' high priestly prayer and the traditional singing of one of the Hallel Psalms. Now that's either likely Psalm 136 or it could be Psalm 115 through 118. So he does what's traditional after the Passover. He does the high priestly prayer, and then they sing this hymn. And this comes after the third cup of wine. They would pass around 3 cups, and this comes after the third cup. Now this Jesus band makes their way through the streets of Jerusalem deep into the night. It's late, but there's still much activity going on in the city. Many homes send out couriers to gather needed supplies for the meal, and many go out to offer gifts to the poor. That was a tradition that they did during Passover. Some, they head to the temple, which was reopened at midnight to prepare for the massive number of sacrifices that were going to go on the next day. And so Jesus leads his disciples out of the city through the eastern temple gate. And they cross over the brook of Kidron, and they ascend the Mount of Olives. As they do this, they come upon an enclosed wooded area called Gethsemane. Now Gethsemane means oil press. So it was apparently a private olive grove that Jesus had permission to go to frequently. So he was going there as they went there very often. He leaves 8 of the apostles at the gate of the garden, and then he tells them to pray
so that they will not fall into temptation. Then he and the inner three, Peter, James, and John, they go to the interior of the grove, and with his closest friends and a keen awareness of his impending passion, Jesus is stricken with grief. Now, the English translation here hardly does justice to the seriousness of this suffering that Jesus is about to get. Between Matthew and Mark, there are 3 different words used to describe Jesus' inner turmoil. His sorrow is so strong, he feels like he's about to die. All right? He feels like he's about to die right there in the garden. Jesus' suffering begins in Gethsemane, not at Golgotha. Jesus is suffering right now as he goes into this garden. 2 days earlier, Jesus mentioned how grief-stricken he was, yet it is here that he begins to realize the weight of the guilt from the sins of the world and the imminent absence of his Father. All right? He's starting to feel all of this. And he's starting to feel the absence of his Father. Jesus is grief-stricken by this. And this is a testament, this should be a word to us. That are we grief-stricken when we feel an absence of God? Now, God didn't move, God didn't leave, but when we step away, do we feel that grief that comes from that? When we sin and God has to pull away from, or God pulls away from that sin that we create because of what our condition is, do we feel the grief that Jesus is feeling here because he's having all this sin poured on him and the absence of the Father? These are new feelings for Jesus. He's never felt this before. From the time eternal when Jesus was in with God, when he created the heavens and the earth, Jesus has never felt guilt or abandonment. He asked these 3 best friends to keep watch. And they're not a military sentry to warn Jesus when the enemy is coming. They are to watch by praying, guarding themselves, and joining Jesus in spiritual warfare. Now, Doug doesn't say a lot in our services. This morning he asks for prayer for his friend. This man is a youth minister, and he feels like he's standing alone, and he needs prayer. Jesus, this is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, has asked his friends to stand and pray for him. We need prayer, people. We need to uplift our leaders and our teachers, and we need to pray for them, and we need to pray earnestly for them. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Doug asked this morning and that I'm preaching about it this morning. There's no coincidence in that. This is a message to all of us that we need to be in prayer constantly for these people and for those that are in our leadership positions. So, Mark 14, 35 through 36 says, going a little farther, about a stone's throw beyond them, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And then Luke 22, 43 through 44 says, and an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, after Jesus exhorts the inner 3 to pray, he walks about a stone's throw away. Now, how far that is exactly depends on the size of the stone and your throwing ability. All right? Okay? For some people, it might be 10 feet. For others, it could be 300-400 feet away. We don't know. This much seems clear. It's out of earshot, but it's still within eyesight. This is how far Jesus moves away from them. There, Jesus drops to his knees and then falls on his face under the full moon of the Passover. And in his pain, Jesus addresses his Father with this intimacy. He uses the word Abba. And this is an Aramaic term of endearment that the Jews generally felt too familiar to use in reference to God. The Jews would never have called God Abba. It's just too much. It's too familiar. It means Father. And you hear this a lot. I heard a story one time of these people. They were in an eastern country, and they were at this horse show. And this man was tending his horses, and he had a little girl. And the little girl comes running across to meet her daddy, and she's yelling, Abba, 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 which she was yelling for her father. And it really meant a lot to this man when he heard this little girl yelling, Abba, and it was great passion and an excitement to see her dad. And he said, this is how we should be. When we go to seek God, we should think of him as our Father. And it is very intimate. It's not that we're dumbing down the name and we're bringing him down to our level. We're actually exalting him as our Father. And that's what this word Abba means. It's in Aramaic and it's a term of endearment. And the Jews didn't use it, but Jesus was very intimate with it because it was his Father. So he used it in that way. Jesus then prays these words. He says, "Take this cup from me." Now watch out here, because if Jesus doesn't drink this cup of suffering, our eternal destinies are left hanging precariously in the balance. Woe to us had Jesus not finished his prayer when he said, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." See, Jesus doesn't have to die. There is no moral imperative calling for his execution. He's done nothing wrong. Furthermore, there was no earthly power forcing him to do it. So Jesus dies by choice. So why does Jesus ask to avoid the cross? Does this not make him weaker than these other martyrs who marched resiliently to their executions with not so much as a grimace? Is he less of a man than these apostles that went to their death as martyrs? The question has led some to say that the cup which Jesus was speaking of was not the cross, but a premature death in Gethsemane. He was, after all, sorrowful unto death, and furthermore, he has suffered. His suffering led to some kind of this bloody sweat, which could have been life-threatening. So it is suggested that Jesus prays for God to spare his life for another 15 hours or so. Well, a better explanation seems to follow this line of reasoning, not that. First, it's not cowardice to want to avoid death or to look for another way out. That's not being a coward. Bravery is defined by a person's actions, not his or her emotions. All right? Probably very relevant on Veterans Day coming up. A lot of these veterans, a lot of these soldiers, they were scared to death. It's like Harvey said. He said, he got a medal for bravery. He said, I wasn't brave. I was scared to death. No. Being scared is an emotion. Bravery is doing what you're meant to do. And these soldiers do this, and Jesus did this. He was scared of what was going to happen, but he went forward with it anyway. So he's not a coward. And it's not that he was weak, it's just that this was an emotion that he was feeling, and he had never felt this before. Secondly, it's not fair to compare Jesus' death with martyrdom. Martyrs die for a cause, all right? Jesus died for the sins of the world. He died for the sins of the world. You can take up a lot of causes, but you can't die for the sins of the world, which is what Jesus did. So we can't compare him to these martyrs. His was so much bigger and so much more immense. He became sin on the cross and took in his own body the sins of the world. And what troubled Jesus was not the physical torture of a martyr, but it was the spiritual torment of God-man, experiencing for the first time both the guilt of humanity and the separation from the Father. There is no way we can understand how far Jesus had to condescend in order to do all this. We just have no idea how far he went. And consequently, we are unable to measure the depth of his spiritual torture. So many times when we say, when something bad happens with somebody, there's a death in somebody, I can't imagine what you're going through. Well, apply this to Jesus. You can't imagine what Jesus had to go through here. Finally, had Jesus marched like some stoic through the passion, we could have little hope of him understanding our human frailty. Jesus was experiencing what we would experience as a human. If he just had marched through all this and had not faced him, it would have been like, well, he was using his divinity to get through all this and find comfort in that. But he did not do that. It is, paradoxically, his humanity that draws us to his divinity. Amen? It's because he was human and because he chose to be that we can relate to him, that it draws us to his divineness. Now, the writers of Hebrews recalls the weight of this prayer to Jesus in Hebrews 5:7. It says, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Jesus submitted to God's will. So now there's a second question that arises from Jesus' prayer. Was there another way? Jesus uses a first-class conditional clause in Matthew where it says, if it is possible. So this speaks of a real possibility, at least in Jesus' mind, that there may be another way. In Mark, it is even more bold, because in Mark he says, everything is possible with you. So it's kind of like he's leading. God, if there's any other way to do this, and I know everything's possible with you, so if there's another way, show me. So theoretically, there may have been another way to save humanity without a vicarious death. But that's just mere speculation. God's sovereign will had determined that His own Son would die for the sins of the world. And therefore, in reality, there was no other choice. God had ordained it from the beginning of time when sin set forth into this earth, and there was no other way. Jesus was determined to carry out His Father's will, no matter how unpleasant or painful the consequences were going to be. And so while it's not unnatural for Dr. Luke to mention either the angel or the physical condition of Jesus' bloody sweat, the text of Luke in chapter 22, verses 43 through 44, has some weak textual support, you see. In other words, it's not found in the oldest manuscripts, what Luke wrote here. Since it's more likely that this information would be later added than purposely dropped, he concluded that it was probably penned by Luke, but added later, likely based on oral traditions. So, we accept it as true, but not as a part of the original text. So it tells us that in the midst of Jesus' suffering, an angel came and ministered to him. And that would be the first time since his wilderness temptation 3 years earlier. And as a result of his suffering, Jesus experienced what Luke describes as sweat like drops of blood. Now this most likely medical explanation for this is hematidrosis. Alright? And it's a condition where the capillaries of the forehead will actually burst due to stress. Well, I think this accurately describes Jesus' condition. He was under a tremendous amount of stress right now, and I mean, so much stress, like I said, we can't even fathom what he was experiencing. So this condition might have happened to Jesus since he was fully human. Now Matthew 26, let's finish this up with Matthew 26, 40 through 46. It says, Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, My Father, if it's not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. And when he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of the sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So 3 times Jesus prays, Father, let this cup pass from me. And 3 times God answers his prayer, no. All right, he tells him no. God could send Jesus an angel in this hour. He could promise him a resurrection, and he could restore him to the heavenly throne room. But it is not his will to release Jesus from this task. All right? So neither our prayers or our faith are weak merely because God says no to our requests. So many times we think that our prayers are weak or our faith is weak when we don't get our answers. That's not the case. God told Jesus no 3 times here. Is he going to tell you no? Well, probably. You're not Jesus. And so he's probably going to tell us no, but it does not mean that our prayers or our faith is weak. Okay, although this passage is not directly about prayer, we can learn a lot from it. We're called to pray like Jesus, but typically wind up praying like Peter. That's usually the way it is. We're supposed to pray like Jesus, but we end up like Peter. 3 times Jesus returns to the inner 3, and 3 times he finds them sleeping. He singles out Peter, asking him, Could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Now, although this is not an exact 60 minutes, This gives us some indication of how long Jesus' prayer was when he went out there the first time. He was out there quite a while. And so it gives the impression that his first prayer was pretty extensive. Likely he picks on Peter because just a few hours earlier he had boasted that he would even die for Jesus. That's probably why I singled out Peter, because Peter said, I will die for you, Jesus. And so he probably singles him out. And just a few minutes from now, Peter will draw his sword and bear down on Malchus. And we'll learn about that later. The conclusion here is that Peter is willing to fight with a physical sword for Jesus, but he's too sleepy to fight with the spiritual weapons of war. How many of us say that we would fight to the death for Jesus, or that we would die for Jesus? A lot of us say it. And it's really easy to die for something, but it's a lot harder to stop and pray in that spiritual warfare. And it's hard to get on our knees every day and fight that spiritual battle. But that's what we're in here, people. It's not a physical battle. We don't fight with the physical things of this world. We fight a spiritual warfare, and it's something we have no idea what's going on in the heavens, in that dimension that God lives in, and the battles that he fights for us each and every day. But we have to be in that battle. We have to be in that fight, and we have to stay diligent. And we have to do this. If we leave our post, we leave everybody exposed. And this is what's happened to Doug's friend. People have left him. His soldiers and his companions have left him, and he's fighting this battle by himself. And he's in a spiritual battle. And when you're fighting something, it's not a weakness to ask for help. Jesus asked all 11 of his guys to pray, especially his 3 best. He brought them with him, and what did they do? They fell asleep. And this is what happens to us. We get complacent. I mean, they were comfortable. They were out there. They had Jesus. He was still around. They had their protector. They didn't have anything to worry about. They could nod off and they could sleep and they could take a rest. And this is where we get to. We feel we're in that same condition. We get comfortable. We get complacent with what Jesus and what God has provided us. We're so blessed that we just kind of fall asleep. And we need to wake up. It's every hour. It could be a final hour. So try as they might, they just can't stay awake, these guys. They're fatigued with sorrow. It had been an exhausting week of great emotional peaks and valleys. If we recap, on Sunday was the triumphal entry. Monday was the cleansing of the temple. Tuesday was the great day of discussions and controversies with the great leaders of Israel. And on each evening, let's not forget that they had to walk several miles back to Bethany where they were staying. On Wednesday and Thursday, they were spent preparing for the Passover when Jesus said things like, I'm leaving you. You'll be persecuted. One of you will betray me, and the rest of you will abandon